I'm joined now by Lorcán. He's an Irish barrister and he's also legal counsel for the Alliance Defending Freedom. So Lorcán does a lot of work with the UN Court of Human Rights. It's great to have you with us today, Lorcán. Thanks for being with us on the Pro-Life Campaign webinar.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you for the invitation.
So one of the things that we wanted to talk with you about today was just the recommendations that were made in the report of the 3-year review to Ireland's abortion legislation. And also last week, the passage of Breed-Smith's abortion bill. It passed at second stage. How do you feel about both of those things?
Yeah, they're quite disturbing developments, really, and they seem to have come quickly on top of each other. Obviously, we knew there was going to be the 3-year review into the legislation, and of course, Breed-Smith can bring forward her own legislation as an independent. What I think was disturbing to see was the extent to which it was supported by kind of cross-party in the Oireachtas, in the Dáil, and the absence really of any concerted effort from the government to say that this is a radical piece of legislation. I mean, in terms of the review first, this review is presented to as an evidence-based exercise, and what strikes me is that one of the key recommendations really is the elimination of the waiting periods that are in the law currently. And what I would say there is, if we're going to conduct evidence-based reviews, we have to look at all the evidence and not just kind of a partial element of it. And according to the HSE, there are 4,000 women that went for a first appointment who didn't go for a second appointment in the context of an abortion appointment. And those 4,000 stories, I mean, some of them will be very different, but they weren't explored in the report. So Barrister Marie O'Shea has recommended the limitation of this waiting period without having explored those stories. And we know this because Heather Tobin asked her a direct question and she met with the women who changed their minds and she said no. So I think that's very concerning if we're going to take seriously any report like this. And this seems to have fed in as well to what Breed-Smith is doing with the elimination of the waiting periods, which is that we have essentially a proposal that doesn't seem to really pay any attention to the stories of women who changed their minds and why. And it strikes me that it's just a case of wanting more and more and more abortion rather than looking at
how does that strike you, from the author of the report is a barrister, from a legal background like yourself, that, as you mentioned, a particular piece of evidence, I know she based her recommendations on abolishing the 3-day period of reflection on a piece of research done by a group of pro-abortion doctors, which was a very small sample size. And those doctors said 2% of women didn't return, whereas the data that you mentioned, the HSE data, which encompasses thousands of women over a number of years, the figure was 17%. So there's a big difference between those two figures, and that in itself is concerning. But surely the job of someone putting together a report like this, as you said, is to take into account all of the evidence. So what does it say to you that some evidence was ignored?
Well, it raises significant questions, I think, about the report and its claims to be evidence-based. I think Heather Tobin's question to the author was really well made, because it asked that question of, have you dug into those figures of women who changed their minds? And the answer we got was no. Of course, I mean, within that cohort of 4,000, there'll be different reasons why people didn't come back. But we deserve, and it's owed to us, if we're going to review the law in a radical way, to know why that is and to look in a really detailed and systematic way at that. So giving a recommendation of the abolition of the 3-day period without considering all of those things, or without any evidence that they were considered, raises a lot of questions about the report. And there are also other things in the report that are concerning as well, such as this obligation in the law regarding misinformation, so that doctors wouldn't be they would be prevented from providing misinformation. I mean, those kind of terms, in the absence of really detailed analysis of what that means, raise additional concerning questions. And it seems to me that we're moving towards a point of taking a law that many of us already vigorously opposed during the course of the referendum, which is quite liberal, and then even making it more open-ended, not looking at the damage and the destruction, of course, that abortion is doing to the lives of women caught up in it, and just calling for more and more, and then trying to cut down on the amount of information that doctors can give describing it as misinformation. And I don't think it's any stretch of the imagination to say we're talking about pro-life voices and pro-life doctors in that context.
Yeah, because I mean, it's not,
disturbing.
there's no actual, they don't actually define what misinformation are you talking about. So the inference, certainly, it's very clear that it'll be doctors who might have a conscientious objection or might go themselves, but not even that, Lorcán. It's fair to say that, you know, you can have a doctor who would say, well, based on my clinical experience, for example, or based on a peer-reviewed research that they've read, that's the reason that they're giving particular advice to a patient. And of course, every patient is different. So what sort of precedent does that set? That the government is then basically saying that we're saying to you, you have to ignore your clinical judgment, you have to ignore the evidence that you might be using to inform the information you're giving out, and we're going to enforce you to withhold that. That sets a bit of a dangerous precedent, not just from the perspective of this particular issue, but other issues too.
It certainly does. I mean, you've hit the nail on the head when you said we weren't told what misinformation encompasses, so we really don't know what it is. And for instance, you have doctors in the UK like consultant obstetrician Dermot Carney, who's recommending abortion pill reversal procedures. And that's been called misinformation by certain pro-abortion lobby groups. So, you know, misinformation is a highly contested term, and without a really precise insight into what that means in a definition, I don't think it's appropriate to include it in a report. And I don't think if legislation does follow from the government side on this, which is a possibility, it would be appropriate to include anything like that in the law whatsoever.
I think one of the things that can be frustrating, and you touched on it earlier, Lorcán, was that a lot of the information in this report, there was no attempt to scrutinise it or analyse it or even cross-check some of the information that was included in it. And sometimes when these things are discussed, and certainly watching the recent Health Committee discussing the review, often campaigners kind of cite the World Health Organization or use those phrases like, you know, international evidence or best practice internationally, almost as to bolster their claims, but then the consequence seems to be that there's absolutely no analysis of you know, in depth of the report and how it might have been carried out.
Well, I'm always suspicious of references to any of the United Nations bodies like the World Health Organization, because these organizations see abortion as healthcare, and that's their starting premise, which it's not. Abortion is not healthcare. It's an optional decision that results in the end of the life of an unborn child. And they also see it as a human right. That runs throughout the UN system, this view that access to abortion is a human right. That has no basis in international law either. So whenever we see any claims coming from you know, the United Nations system, be it the human rights bodies or the World Health Organization, we have to really scrutinize their ideological perspective before we start to accept any of their claims as set in stone. And frankly, the ideological perspective as abortion is healthcare and a human right is one that I say is entirely unsupported by international law. Now, we have our own, obviously we changed the law in Ireland, you know, in 2018. And arguably some people have argued that abortion is now a right in the Irish Constitution, although I don't think that can be directly taken. But there seems to be a cohort in Ireland, certainly, leaning on the work of the United Nations and so on, who are determined to remove any barriers to abortion, to turn it into a de facto right, where access to it will be unrestricted as much as possible. And I think that you know, obviously is deeply harmful to women, and it's catastrophic for the unborn child.
One of the things that, you know, that's also suggested is to basically decriminalize abortion entirely. Now, those who are pushing for this are saying, no, it wouldn't necessarily permit abortion up to birth for any reason. Where do you stand on that, Lorcán, from a legal perspective?
Well, this is something that's come up in Breed Smith's legislation, and Maria O'Shea's report just called for this as such, but it definitely alludes to it as a possibility, and there's some very vague and troubling language. But we already have this legislation that passed second stage now at the Oireachtas from the far left. And I think it's extraordinary to call for decriminalisation. It goes much further than the United Kingdom, for example, which has a very liberal abortion regime, where there's still a penalty in law, even under the 1967 Act, which is a defence to carrying out abortion. There's still a criminal penalty in law. It's a completely radical proposal. If you say, just as a general proposition, that removing any criminal penalty for an abortion would be something that we tolerate in the law, then my question logically follows is, where is the obligation then in law to preserve the right of the unborn child to life? Some would say, well, it kicks in at viability, but there's no suggestion in any Irish legislation that would be the case, even the Breed-Smith legislation. So, if there's no penalty for taking the life of the unborn child in a wide set of circumstances, does it have any rights in practice? I mean, you have your right to property because there's a penalty associated with me if I try and take your car away from you, or your handbag, or so on. The way you protect rights in law is by penalising conduct that undermines them. It's certainly a principal way you protect them. So if you remove any penalty to abortion and say that it can happen in any circumstances without any possible follow-up with criminal law, then yes, I think it's entirely reasonable to say that puts the rights of the child up to birth at risk. And that, again, taking into account the report from Marie O'Shea and the legislation of Breed-Smith, the direction of travel, sadly, in Ireland seems to be to have the most radical, open-ended abortion law in Europe. And there's a powerful lobby with its supporters in the media and in the Oireachtas, and sadly in parts of the medical profession as well, who seem to want to push this as far as possible. And we were told after the 2018 referendum by a number of senior politicians in Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael that there wouldn't be any changes to the legislation contemplated at that point because the people had spoken. And now here we are 4 or 5 short years later, and all of the direction seems to be to widen it as much as possible. And I think that that's a deeply regressive step.
And everybody watching, I think, will feel that as well, Lorcán. But I think it's important in these times where we can feel a little bit despondent looking at some of the issues that we've talked about, to lose hope. And of course, we can't do that. And I just wanted to ask you if maybe you'd share with us just some of your experience. You do a lot of work in many different countries around the world, and you have many examples of causes for hope. Is there any particular ones you'd like to share with us that would give you hope for the future?
Yeah, I think we're all well aware of the developments in the United States, where my colleagues were working in the Dobbs case. But to come back over to Europe, the pro-life movement is energized in Europe. And even though we're new into the abortion on demand space, but our colleagues in Europe, our friends in Europe, have been working in that really for over a generation in many cases. And you have to become very creative in those circumstances. So we've been involved in cases in Slovenia where we won in the courts where they tried to ban pro-life advertising, which brings forward the humanity of the unborn child. We were successful there. We had a case at the European Court of Human Rights as well for the Jérôme Lejeune Foundation, which really does some excellent work in defending the rights of children with Down syndrome. So they had an amazing ad, you can check it out online, called Dear Future Mom. It's on YouTube, of children with Down syndrome saying to their parents, thank you for having me, and our life together has been so rich. So that the French Audiovisual Council tried to ban that ad from French television, and we fought that case successfully. So, in a space where abortion becomes part of the culture, we have to be very creative. We have to talk about the humanity of the unborn child, and we have to continue to find ways to open up that discussion as much as possible. And I think there are plenty of examples of that happening in Europe. So I'm confident we will be just as creative in Ireland as our European friends and neighbours.
Well, it's interesting to hear those examples, Lorcán, just of, as you say, creative ways, and the key is showing the humanity of the unborn child, the humanity and the beauty. Just that lovely example from that ad about people with Down syndrome is a really great example. Well, we thank you for joining us on the webinar today, and of course the continued good work that you are doing. I know you're very busy, guys, so appreciate you taking the time out. Lorcán Price, thank you so much for joining us on our webinar this evening.
Thank you, Wendy. It was a pleasure.